Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Cal Brooks. Welcome to another Jacobin Talk. We've been doing these videos several days a week, regularly since the start of the pandemic. We invite on a left-wing thinker, organizer, writer, activist to talk about something pertinent to the left. And as you probably already can tell from the title of this video, we're going to be covering the history of the Young Democratic Socialists of America. And to do that, we are joined by David Duhalde.
Hi.
David. Hi, David. David is a lifelong DSA member. He is the former political director for Our Revolution. He's been in various staff roles within the DSA. Most recently, he was the youth organizing committee or coordinator.
Most recently, the deputy director, but before that.
Deputy director, and then, yes, and then youth coordinator. David is probably the perfect person to describe the history of both DSA and for our purposes tonight, YDSA. So very happy to have him with us. For what it's worth, I was a part of the Bernie 2016 bump. I came in, I was somewhat political before 2016, and then Bernie got me activated as like a actual organizer, as a canvasser, as a phone banker, getting involved in Medicare for All. And a lot of people, I think, were in that trajectory, like me. And for many of us, we didn't really know our place on the left, that we came to this because it was a world historic moment. Bernie Sanders galvanizing basically a generation of millennials to hit the streets. But there's a gap in left history. And part of it's just that for the last 40 years, the left has been in a place of losing. And so, my roommate. So it's important to understand how the left existed in this time period. How did we end up in the situation we're in? And then what can we take away from the history of YDSA? And look to the future and understand where do organized socialists in America move forward from here. So with that, I'll let you take it away, David.
Thank you so much, Cale. It's been a real pleasure to work with you and to really bring this presentation to life. For me, this is very special. As he mentioned, I was the staff organizer for the Young Democratic Socialists of America from 2006 to 2008. And also before that was a chapter activist at Bowdoin College and served on what is now called the National Coordinating Committee. And I think that it's important for us to remember that there might not even be a Jacobin if there wasn't Young Democratic Socialists of America, as Bhaskar Sunkara, Peter Fraze, Chris Maizano, Amber Frost, and many others who were some of the initial contributors and catalysts, pun intended, of Jacobin, who came out of the youth section with me. So I also want to take some time to do some other important acknowledgements. So this project was part of an effort to create a new entry into the second edition of the Encyclopedia of the American Left that's edited by Mary Joel and Paul Buell, DSA members in Wisconsin, who invited myself to do this. And I had tremendous support from Ben Kreider, who served as the research assistant who brought together this project in writing the entry with me. But we also conducted almost 200 surveys of youth section alumni covering nearly 4 decades, and conducted about 24 interviews to really learn what each generation of youth section activists brought. And you can do the next slide. And then it's also important to remember that this was done with the support of the Democratic Socialists of America Fund, who gave a grant to support our research. I would also add that I'm the vice chair of the fund, so for full disclosure, but I included that earlier image because the DSA fund has supported the Young Democratic Socialists of America through scholarships, through supporting the conferences, through grants for decades now. And so it's been a tremendous supporter of the youth section. And so for some broader also context to take this back, I think it's important to look at, what's going on in YDSA today. So YDSA is going through tasks and perspectives where they're having internal discussions about what's the future of their youth section. And I participated in giving a similar history talk to them last week about this to help guide their work. In addition, we've really seen the youth section grow tremendously from when it was about 4 or 5 chapters when I was a student to nearly 130 groups across campuses in the United States. So how it's gone from such a small organization to such a large organization really reflects, some of the political context and organizational transformations that DSA has gone through as well. And so what I want to discuss are, there are 4 large points, if you will, a thesis that I'll be touching upon that Ben and I developed through our research about the Young Democratic Socialists of America. So the first is, and you can do the next slide, is that labor activism is always central to the organization. So, and that it will change over time, and we'll discuss this, but the need for union solidarity, for supporting workers on campuses, for broadly engaging the labor movement on a whole is just paramount throughout YDS's history. The next thesis that we have is the youth section, which is what I will call it from now on. I should have explained that earlier. That's the constitutional name of the Young Democratic Socialists and of America, and we'll go over the different name changes. But that's a good segue to explain that that DSA and the Young Democratic Socialists' respective strengths, if some have a lot of chapters, some have fewer chapters relative to their size, actually doesn't necessarily correspond exactly. So we've seen times where the Young Democratic Socialists or the youth section appears much more vibrant pound for pound than DSA and vice versa. The next, which is on a similar note, is the strength and size of of this also corresponds to how the youth section mirrors different elements of the social justice movements. So you'll see discussions in this history that cover debates that are happening within the youth section or within YDSA that are very much reflective of what's going on outside of YDSA in the organization. And the last, also connected to the second and third points, is that it's very important to remember that the growth and size of YDSA is both kind of almost equally determined by internal factors, such as organizing strategies, such as who is in the leadership of the organization, what are the programs, and also external factors, simply as Kale brought up, Bernie Sanders happened and people were talking about socialism more. We'll also discuss how the state of other student organizations impact the Young Democratic Socialists of America and their size. So I think before we do that, we really need to go over, though, how everything began. So that is why this talk will begin to discuss, the origins, first in one organization called the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and then with the New American Movement. So next slide, please. So here is an example of a summer conference for the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. So, and you can see at the bottom right, people wearing DSOC t-shirts. So first, let's take a step back. What is the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee? Well, there was the split in the Socialist Party of America in the early 1970s into three different separate organizations. One is the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, or I'll call it DSOC from now on, which represented the wing that was most interested in transforming the Democratic Party of the United States into a social democratic party, engaging with the labor movement leadership to push it in a more progressive direction, and connecting with other more progressive social movements. So this organization doesn't is multi-generational, but eventually it becomes more younger over time, and doesn't necessarily need a youth section off the bat. And important to remember, the Young People's Socialist League, which had been the youth wing of the Socialist Party of America, that went with the Social Democrats USA. So they inherited a lot of the institutional assets during the split. So DSOC doesn't start off with a youth wing. But by the 1976, you can go to the next slide, there was an attempt to, and a successful one, to bring together a youth conference. So this is an article from DSA's newsletter, The Democratic Left, which highlights that there was a multi-generational gathering, and the article is by Cynthia Ward. So Cynthia Ward is the first kind of, not full-time, but person who was hired by DSOC to staff the youth section. So, and that actually starts a very important tradition that's basically unbroken until I was deputy director, and I both did other responsibilities and staffed the youth section, of always having a full-time staffer in charge of making sure that the YDSA events happen. So the first full-time staffer, which many people are familiar with, and I want to give him a plug, and you'll see him later in the presentation, was Joe Schwartz, who was the first full-time staffer. So this begins a founding conference in 1976 for multi-generational, but the actual founding happened in 1977. And in our research, we see that, talking to people in the initial, it starts like with a handful of chapters, but there's lots of enthusiasm for democratic socialism in this period, where you were starting to see the, future elections of democratic socialists in Europe and in other parts of the world. So those few chapters start to become many chapters shortly after. So in 1977, there is a founding convention that pretty much starts the unbroken tradition of having summer conferences for the Young Democratic Socialists be the primary decision making conferences. And at this time, you can probably go to the next slide at this point. At this time, also, there is activities for the for the Democratic Socialist Youth Section that center around building anti-war efforts. So even though it's the late 1970s, it's important to remember that there was a large fear of the United States getting involved in around the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Of course, we're still dealing with that today. It's very much in the discourse about withdrawing troops from that country. And that image I showed you was part of a youth section-led effort that got 30,000 people, primarily in Washington, D.C. And New York, to attend this massive anti-draft mobilization that was done in a coalition effort with different groups to bring together these youth and students concerned with the draft. And at this time, too, it's critical to note that there is another democratic socialist organization that would be the second group that's part of a merger that would form the Democratic Social America later, called the New American Movement. So this is an image you can see from the New American Movement. It represents different, it's overwhelmingly younger than DSOC. It's very much, I think, would parallel in terms of age demographics, the DSA that we know today, where most people I assume are under 30, if not under 27 or 28. And so where do these folks come from? They come from the remnants of SDS, Students for Democratic Society. Some of them are coming out of the new communist movement or even the old communist movement, which one of their kind of figures who didn't stay, who wasn't active day to day, but had lots of symbolic, was Dorothy Healy. But her son Richard was very active and still, I think, is a DSA member to this day in California. But she had been probably the most important CPUSA leader in California during a significant period of time. And so because this organization is so young in terms of both its existence and in the demographics of the membership, it doesn't have a youth section at all. There is an effort, however, we discovered through oral history, to create a campus commission. And what distinguishes this effort from the what happens in DSOC, and here, thanks, Kale, you can see a short-lived newsletter of the New American Movement, is DSOC really focuses on students, and that kind of is the beginning of what we really see how YDS's membership is structured today. Whereas the New American Movement tried to organize all NAM members on a given campus. And so that would include not only the students, but faculty, both tenured, visiting, graduate student, and also just staff in general, who are the administrative staff who really make the school run. But by and large, my discussions and Ben's interviews with folks in this era, it wasn't viewed as a tremendous success. There just wasn't. My own theory is that, as someone who's been both a graduate student, an undergrad, and a support staff at a university, folks come from different walks of life. They have their different points of their interests, and so there just wasn't. It didn't create a nucleus that really could keep folks together. So you have this effort largely fail, but it's an interesting moment for us to learn from about how organization happens within democratic socialist processes. So NAM and DSA begin talks to merge, and some of this comes out of proto-examples. So you can go to the next slide. So here's actually an interesting, it's DSA, but it's Democratic Socialist Alliance of Madison. So this is an organ, this was based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So this was not only NAM and DSOC, but I think there were members of the Socialist Party in this group. I received that image from Penny Shantz, who was the second youth section organizer after Joe, and she's still involved in the organization. But also important to know who, besides her, Larry Michelle, who later founded the Economic Policy Institute, came out of that chapter. So these were very critical groups, both in terms of who they were creating, but also in mentoring, but also in creating kind of working models that would serve to be the catalyst for this merger of two different organizations. So when DSA is created out of a merger of DSOC and NAM, what you do notice is there is kind of tension and growing pains around the community groups. So that's like the chapters off campuses. But the U section actually largely remains unchanged because the New American movement doesn't bring as much into the campus groups. So like here's just a fun slide I found from the announcement of the merger at the time. You can see the old-fashioned graphics. So at this point, though, we're into 1982. So we've gone from the hope of defeating Jimmy Carter and electing a progressive Ted Kennedy, and kind of some of the initial hope around Reagan not being a threat, to really seeing that Ronald Reagan is going to be an incredibly popular president, and he's going to enact a very reactionary political agenda that DSA would have to respond to. So a lot of the work that we saw in our research that the U section and DSA was doing, largely was in reaction to the Ronald Reagan agenda. So I mean, there's this involves labor, so DSA and DSOC, and before it, were very instrumental, probably DSOC because of the timing, but in Solidarity Day, which was a large rally in response to the firing of the PATCO workers by the Reagan administration, which really marked the first salvo in really government-led attacks on organized labor for the first time since in some decades. But also foreign policy, where I think it's very important to remember that at this time, there was both a vibrant left abroad and a left that was under deep repression abroad, that the Ronald Reagan administration was unabashedly, supporting oppression for. And so there was a tremendous role for democratic socialists, especially student organizations, to do public education around why U.S. foreign policy and U.S. imperialism was bad. It seems so simple to say, but that's important. So this is like an original document you see here of talks about El Salvador. So also in addition to El Salvador, the DSA did lots of work to support the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. My father's from, to support the democratic forces in Chile, but also abroad as well, outside of the Americas, not in South Africa. And one thing that the U section did that was very concrete was organize a tour in 1986 of trade unionists in support with South Africa, in support with El Salvador. And in this part, I want to hold on to this image, is an article from the Democratic left that's kind of critical to understanding both the time and future work of the U section. So South Africa was a prime target of these of students, for progressive students, and we have a corporate campaign model that develops out of this, where U section chapters, especially at Harvard, where you had Joe Schwartz talked about it, but also others, really emphasize the need to get their universities to divest away from in South Africa. And we will see this also come up in different places. And this is also an important moment to recognize what I brought up earlier in how this reflects the movement. The U section activities reflect the movement in general, in that there were also, debates within DSA about how much to support these organizations and comrades abroad, and in which manner. So it may not be known to some people watching this and known to others, but I think it's sort of worth repeating that DSA and DSOC especially comes out of a very strong anti-Stalinist tradition, was often very wary of working with people who they would identify as big C communists. And these movements abroad, which were democratic with small d, did often involve alliances, especially in South Africa, Chile, and Nicaragua, with Marxist-Leninist organizations in those countries. So debates at this time, especially centered around, do you do solidarity or do you have support with criticisms? And these are kind of the nuances that you see at this time in the U section. But I think the corporate campaign model is like one of the more important ones to emphasize. So the 1980s marks like a youth section that is vibrant, but also really in opposition to Reagan and really mobilizing and educating students about that. And we can go to the next slide. So this is Michael Harrington, which kind of closes out the 1980s, both symbolically and literally. So it's this Michael Harrington, who was the principal leader of DSA, probably its most well-known member, at his last youth conference in 1989. On a little anecdote, as you can see on the upper left, some of the National Coordinating Committee winners of that summer conference election. And with Harrington's death, it's kind of coincides coincidentally with the end of the Cold War. And it was kind of hard to believe back then, but there were people who really felt that this period would be a heyday for democratic socialism, for the democratic left, because they felt that, look, the Soviet Union collapsed. Now people will know, it's not authoritarian socialism, that we can ride to success. And the exact opposite happened. I mean, the whole left, whether you describe it as democratic or undemocratic, goes in crisis as we enter a period where neoliberalism, especially, and, defined by me broadly as like an emphasis to deregulate and privatize the public sector and to reduce restrictions on private business in the private sector, really becomes into a dominant ideological hegemony, best kind of indicated by Margaret Thatcher, former prime minister of, the UK, but there is no alternative. And so this kind of enters a doldrum period, especially for DSA by the mid-1990s, where you have like an organization that has lost its leader, where socialism is no longer viewed as a viable alternative, regardless of whether you quantify it as democratic or not. But going to my earlier thesis, this actually doesn't necessarily negatively affect the Young Democratic Socialists. Young Democratic Socialists are able to stay active, especially around issues of labor, and because it's really still YDSA today, too, serves often as the first touch point for lots of students who don't come from labor backgrounds, as their first introduction to the union movement. And so in some of the activities here at this point are really still educating students, like helping them learn how to get involved in unions, support workers. So there's still lots of activities at this time as well. So at this point, YDSA, which is still the DSA youth section, also takes this corporate campaign model elsewhere. So you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, I'll talk about this. I forgot this part, but it's important. But I think this also reflects why you might see a decline in DSA. So here, there really was not a huge generational entry of people who would be in the Gen X age group to join DSA. So you really have this drop off where people do the youth section for a certain period of time, and then also kind of then just don't join the formal community chapters. And I think this partly reflects that the boomer generation of DSA activists and people who came out of that could really compensate for the lack of support among socialism for that age group, but really still the Gen X is still, it's probably of the younger generation, still the most pro-capitalist as an ideology and anti-socialist and least sympathetic to of the younger generations. And you see that tremendous change later on. So going back to, and you can go to the next slide too, the corporate campaign model also shifts here, where you, instead of focusing on the foreign policy, as I alluded to earlier, because the Cold War is over, and lots of those parties are now in bourgeois democracies aren't oppressed. The campaign model goes to what really a harbinger for like the abolitionist movement of today. Well, one element of it is this anti-prison industrial complex campaign that the youth section spearheaded, called the Prison Moratorium Project. So here's an article, from the Democratic left that chronicles like a concert that was held to support this effort. So now the Prison Moratorium Project is its own independent organization. And that also is a bit of a harbinger for future work where you see that the success of the Young Democratic Socialists of America kind of catalyzes and brings about things that go beyond its original scope that were being housed in the youth section. So this Prison Moratorium Project focused on getting, like similar to South Africa, getting schools to divest from the carceral state, and really represented a huge success in terms of the Young Democratic Socialists of America, then still the DSA section at the time, building something sustainable. But at this time also kind of alluding to the kind of dissonance in the success of DSA versus its youth section. Tensions arise that, that people aren't really jumping into DSA, as I said earlier, and really start to wonder if the branding and being associated with DSA makes sense. So you can go to the next slide. So around this, no, there was the newspaper one. Yeah. So around this time, you see the Young Democratic Socialists we found articles start to mention the Young Democratic Socialists of America, and the Young Democratic Socialists period. And then by the late 1990s, so no one could, either 98 or 99, depending on who you ask, the organization went through its second game change from DSOC to the Young Democratic Socialists. And this kind of represented a real shift. And I think that took a long time, we'll go over to kind of recover, where the organizations, both the youth section and the community groups, kind of felt separate. You can go back to the other slide now. So at this time too, there is an effort to bring about more work around the North American Free Trade Agreement and introducing students, as I said earlier, to the labor movement. So here was an effort where you can see Ginny Coughlin mentioned, who was a youth organizer who later went on to work for Unite, is bringing together students to learn about garment workers. And this kind of campus labor institute effort, which was, helped really springboard the creation of the United Students Against Sweatshops, or as I'll call them, USAS from now on. So this anti-sweatshop group really served as a catalyst for bringing together student labor groups and to really focus around resistance to the neoliberal view of free trade and how which sweatshops are good or bad. But at this point too, we start seeing a trend in that the Young Democratic Socialists are creating organizations that are kind of actually replacing them. And so at this point, we notice the term we kind of use is like training our replacements, where you see YDSA and DSA creating and establishing programs that end up kind of end up isolating its creators. And so another way to also look at this is that there was this period in time where it was very hard to get a labor staff job, and so people, and then there was tremendous change at the AFL-CIO, where a progressive slate led by John Sweeney, who was a nominal DSA member, comes in. And then suddenly they create programs like Union Summer, which the youth section is very enthusiastic about. But in the short term, really is a key way for young socialists to get involved in the labor movement. But then people end up getting those staff jobs and don't really have time to build DSA in the same way that they used to. So you have this moment where like we are really kind of creating great activists and creating great socialists, as Duraka Lamore Hall, one of the organizers before me, always said that the purpose of his opinion, one of the purposes of DSA was to create great socialists, not necessarily create socialism. We were doing that, but then we weren't retaining them for the organization. So this kind of leads us to like the 2000s, which kind of represent some of the weakest points of the organization's both youth section and community history. And so this is around the time that I joined. And so it's really important to have context that the organization has dwindled from about 12,000 members just after Harrington dies to about 4,000 to 5,000. So this is a real low point. And that's when I mentioned, the chapters and the campus groups are like 3 or 4. But there's still activity here to do. You can go to the next slide. So here are just some pictures of this is during the Bush administration. So here is an example of Michigan State University, YDS, protesting against the war on terror. And you can just go to the next slide quickly. And this here is also just like a rally, again, with the United for Peace and Justice, where we did play a real role, both DSA and YDSA, in student and community peace work. Several of these people are still involved. But I chose this picture intentionally because, if you want to put this in historical context, this rally had about 300,000 people. And this is not a small, this is like pretty much probably a quarter to a third of the people who came out of town for DSA. I mean, I bet you many of your YDSA chapters could generate better turnouts for rallies than the national organization could at that time. And it really reflected, that people didn't view DSA as a real venue to do politics that was tied to making actually meaningful change. So people like me who joined because there was some broader political commitment to democratic socialism, that we had some emotional investment, but it was very reasonable to do your political work elsewhere in ways that I don't think it is today. I think DSA is very much a vibrant organization. You can go to the next slide. So at this time, labor is still central here to the youth section activity. So here's and also the corporate campaign model, but shifting away from labor, does union support, there's more emphasis in like alt labor, which term I don't love, but here is an example of supporting the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is not a union, but is a workers' organization of tomato pickers in Florida who were launching campaigns against fast food chains to get an increase of 1 penny per pound for tomatoes picked. And so YDS, which was called at the time, was always involved in these campaigns to pressure their campuses. From University of Chicago, I remember Maria Savart, current national director of DSA, was involved in that. And here was an example of just us at Burger King doing that. So the corporate campaign model, still remains central to the YDSA structure. At this time also, too, in the Bush administration, there's other activities, especially around immigrants and gay rights. You can go to the next slide. So this was a great historic picture. This was the University of Central Arkansas YDSA chapter and the Queer Student Alliance getting ready to do a banner drop at Governor Mike Huckabee's house in support of gay marriage because of the increasing attacks by the Bush administration and Republicans at the time to kind of to not, because gay marriage was largely legal, but was to create even further barriers towards this legalization. So at this period, you see matters kind of like stagnating, but start recuperating. And by the end of the decade, the historic event of the election of Barack Obama happens. And I think this is important for us to remember that whatever we think about President Obama and his legacy today, I contend, and it's not an original thought by me, I'm not going to plagiarize, but that the attacks on President Obama backfired in certain ways, in that the Republican attacks to kind of label him as a socialist got actually more people interested in learning about what socialism was. And that the people who would then positively identify Barack Obama with socialism, tended to be people we would want broadly in the socialist camp, people who are in the Democratic base or workers, people of color, students, and so forth. And so we are slowly start seeing more and more interest of people asking, what is socialism? And socialism begins a kind of nascent comeback into the popular discourse. But it's still important to remember at this time, Bernie Sanders is still mostly famous to people in DSA. I'm saying that somewhat pejoratively, but he's not a national figure in the same way, despite being a U.S. senator. So that comeback doesn't come till late. So you can go to the next slide. So here's Joseph Schwartz on the left, but here's a rally. Here's a very important point in the trajectory of the organization, where in 2010, the labor movement tried to organize, which kind of was a bust, a rally called the One Nation Rally, where to show the administration support. But for context, about 100,000 people came, with the union spending a ton of money, and nearly 3 times as many people came with Glenn Beck, the right-wing commentator's rally, shortly after, with no institutional support. So it was a low point, for progressives, but it kind of marked this resurgence of DSA and YDSA being able to come together to bring more sizable contingents out. We did a fundraiser with a congressperson later that evening. But more importantly, this kind of marks like the turn against kind of like the honeymoon period that Barack Obama had, with people really getting ready for more active resistance towards him, most exemplified by the Wisconsin uprising, and then Occupy Wall Street is kind of this nascent early 2000s. So you can go to the next slide. So here's just an example of students of DSA jumping in and being active in Occupy Wall Street. So here's an example of Occupy Philly with the DSA banner. And then you can go to the next slide. And then you can see here is the William Patterson University YDS fighting a tuition increase at their school. I think they had some success in this. And I think it's important to note here is, like I'm mentioning, 2 public universities, because this is a point, some of the organizing strategy changes that came under me and stayed was kind of an emphasis on trying to organize more public universities, schools that did not have traditionally strong left organizations, and that did pay dividends. And so this is where I want to also emphasize again, where there's some things are in the control of the youth section, some things aren't. So what was in control was that we could, reorient, instead of trying to organize schools that had competing socialist organizations, or just lots of groups such as USAS that would make it harder to find space for a DSA group or a YDSA group at the time. We organized outside, and we were able to grow, to about a dozen or so groups for a number period of years. But it really is the political moment that changes our trajectory from there. So you can go to the next slide. And it's really and all this is where it's all tied together, where it's like, if there wasn't these resistance movements such as Occupy, there wouldn't be a Bernie Sanders. And really Bernie Sanders' candidacy, apropos what Cale said about his own entering, like really begins a new interest in democratic socialism, and then obviously then interest in DSA and YDSA. So here are just some rallies, and you can go to the next slide in El Paso, and then here's just some conferences. So about this time, we have this steady increase of interest in the Young Democratic Socialists, but the conferences are still relatively small. At this point, the chapters probably nationally are about 15 to 20 chapters at a given point, and the interest and the activities we're doing emphasize around issues that really are part of the Bernie Sanders agenda later on, especially around student debt. So, when we saw the William Parrish's students, fighting tuition cases, that really these kind of student issues become at the forefront of the student issues. But at this point, still, like, there isn't a space for YDS to have its breakthrough yet. And I think there's a couple of reasons there, which go to my point about the external factors. Is simply that there's College Students for Bernie, which YDSA did team up with and got some of the chapters to join later. Still is like the dominant way for people to be active in supporting the campaign. At this point, there's still the United States Student Association, which represented at one point 1.1 million students and served as kind of the de facto student union in this country. And USAS and other groups really, and most importantly also the IS International Socialist Organization, all represent kind of competition for YDSA. And so so I want to just juxtapose two different pictures so you can kind of go to the next slide. So here's the YDSA conference in 2016. So this is like during the heart of the Bernie Sanders first campaign. You see about like, about a few dozen, kids and students. And then you can go to the next one. And then 2017, it's like 5 times as large. So, it's really this sea change happens that is totally outside of anyone's expectations, where you have a renewed interest in democratic socialism, and that the YDSA becomes kind of the catalyst for that interest. And I think at this point, too, it's important to put matters also, again, I'm always putting it in context, the rising tides lifted all boats here, as opposed to the 1990s where there was this similar growth in DSA and YDS. DSA is also growing gangbusters at this point. And so there's this kind of rapprochement, if you will let me say, between the youth section and DSA. And I think that there's much more similarities and connections between how each organization tried to mirror each other's work. So like there was some symbolic importance. So, for years, DSA was very proud of being members of the Social International, and YDS at the time it was called, or was proud of being members of the International Union of Socialist Youth. So these were like the heirs. These were the global social democratic federations. DSA voted to leave at its convention in 2017 from the Social International almost unanimously. And then YDSA followed suit a few years later to voting to leave as well. And importantly at this time, too, is like when, because of the better reputation of DSA and its more prominence in American society, the name was changed for its third time from the Young Democratic Socialists to the Young Democratic Socialists of America. And so really bringing the organizations together. And I think part of that also, you see kind of how these things are mimicked and mirroring, where in addition to both the Sanders work serving as a way to unite both the student section and the community section, you also see changes in labor organizing. Going back to my first point, which is that there is greater emphasis now on what would be called a rank and file orientation, which is like encouraging students and workers, to get jobs where there are unions, as opposed to my time in DSA, which it would have been much more like you would have been encouraged to become a union organizer or get a staff job. And so I think that those shifts in both the community and youth section kind of represent that there's more cohesion, there's more, there's more of a united political program across the organization, that they're not as separate. But there's still things that need to be done that are still unique to students. So you can go to the next slide now. So, as I mentioned earlier, there were several organizations that existed in 2016 that basically don't exist today. So one, is very importantly, is the United States Student Association, the de facto student union, and the International Socialist Organization. So you see this space that DSA has to pick up on both ends. So one is lobbying for federal work that the other student groups might have done at the time. So here, there's a COVID campaign, which I'm hoping people will put in the links around work that's getting done there. And for the next one I'll mention. And also for this representing socialism on campus. And so another example too is, YDSA today is still continuing the student debt work, and really has to, because there really is no group that's going to be as prominent or as spread out as while to really fight for both student and young worker issues around student debt. So here's an emphasis, and you can sign up. And hopefully someone's putting in the link to sign the petition to really push the incoming Biden administration to cancel student debt. And the last thing I would just say here is there was a much stronger emphasis on, organizing the student for Bernie groups than when I was on staff, because also there was more political potential. So you really see the fruits of that coming out with more and more of those former student for Bernie groups becoming YDSA chapters. So I'm going to stop there. Because I think there'll probably be things we can answer in the questions, but I do appreciate people's patience. It's a lot of history to go through.
Thank you so much, David. And like you just said, it's an incredible amount of history, and I think it's very important for people to know this trajectory. And I'm gauging that partly by the questions and just also my own appreciation of this as someone who is an organizer, that this really does help clarify kind of the institutional capacity, the organizational capacity that we have now. Anytime, something will happen in DSA where I'll get frustrated or annoyed, and I'll talk to an older comrade who's like, "You should have seen the '90s. Like, you think this is bad? Like, it's completely different." And so it's both important to know what the connections are, what the kind of the long-lasting strengths are. I think something that maybe would surprise people is how much international solidarity was a part of YDSA. And then also, it's funny because I kind of skimmed over my bio in this up front, that I came through College Students for Bernie, connecting with an emerging YDSA chapter or YDS chapter on campus, and now I'm here in DSA. And so this is kind of what we got, for better or worse. This is what the left is in America right now. And so I think it's important to understand what these things are. So funny enough, I got to run in a couple minutes because I'm actually helping with a political education event through DSA for the ABCs of Capitalism. But I wanted to get to a couple questions. And I think the first one, because a couple people were asking about this, is Charlie Mueller asked specifically, can you talk about the class composition of YDSA over time? And another viewer, James, was asking, kind of in response to that, could David also address the Ehrenreich's PMC analysis, the New Left and the student movement, and the broader question of college-educated socialists trying to connect to the working class? So I think, yeah, what is the class analysis of socialists in America over this period? And has it changed now, I guess?
I'm just going to be honest about that. I'm not as familiar with Ehrenreich's work on that, so I'm just going to answer as honestly as I can. And if people want to follow up, they can. My email is just david.dsausa@gmail. I think that I don't have any exact demographic information, but our studies, in our research, we saw that it was much more multi-class organization than I think people gave it credit for, and a lot of working class students were attracted throughout the generations to it, because I think there was a view, that it was both pragmatic, and that you could be working for real gains. And so I think that there was lots of folks who I remember just talking, were especially youth organizers were the first of their families to really go to college. So it was probably more mixed. And I think that what I mentioned, I alluded to earlier, and I'll be more specific, is there was a real emphasis on, elite universities as the place to organize, which I think represents a class attitude, maybe a PMC attitude, so to speak. I'm just trying to connect to the question, even though I just can't honestly answer as well as I could, wish I could. there was an effort under me and other people to continue this, to really look for like public schools that wouldn't have as many elite credentials. And I think, so it didn't necessarily change the class composition. Like the University of Central Arkansas, was very working class school, but there were some very well-connected people in that chapter to the Arkansas elite, who I'm still friends with, so I think it's sometimes it can be obscured. So I do think though that, the changes in the labor movement strategy are really worth looking at and probably deserve their own presentation both with DSA and YDSA about how the effort goes from like supporting labor leadership to kind of doing corporate campaigns to like rank and file strategy and how that relates. I think it's worthwhile, and that's why I wanted to also talk about how labor remains central, because we're a socialist organization, but it's not without being good materialists and recognizing conditions change and how we relate to the workers' movement.
Right, and I have a follow-up question to this, and I would just add that for what it's worth, I think the Ehrenreich's analysis of the time, I think there's a lot of good in there. I think the class analysis is maybe not great. It was good for the time. I think Eric Olin Wright has a superior class analysis, but that's an entirely different thing. But the point being that like I think there is a reasonable tension with I think the example they give is like a steel worker and a college professor coming to the same organization. I think it's fair to say there's a tension, but it doesn't need to be a tension. And in fact, I think she actually, her and Barbara and John end that essay by saying, the problem isn't necessarily that socialists are middle class. In fact, most of history, like people who end up in socialist organizations are going to be a little bit more working or a little more middle class than people who end up in unions and in labor organizations, because those are associations of workers. And so that's not necessarily the issue, but I wanted to get your thoughts on more concretely, like what should the relationship be between left organizations, socialist organizations, and labor unions, associations, institutions, and kind of the working class, unorganized, as well as that. What are those what should that relationship be? What are those connections? I think you did outline a good chunk of it in your presentation, but maybe just to kind of
recap
and
I think, like,
make it a little more
related
explicit.
To what I mentioned earlier about the New American Movements Campus Commission, I think that's also where I want to touch upon, is that like if there's one thing where we've had a constant debate in YDSA for student generations of students, and is like, should it be an organization that's primarily students, or should it have organizations of non-students? And I just think that what I would contend is, will connect to what you're asking, is that, the way organizations of young people are built in this country, except for very few exceptions, the goal for YDSA really is to like serve as a place to make people good socialists and to make them better worker organizers. Like, I'm a union member now, and I've learned a lot and will be a better union member because of my time in a democratic socialist organization. And so I think that it really is about developing people who can both advance our values and our worldview in those working class organizations, but then also serving as a way to kind of nurture those ideas. And I think that the big debate I have in myself is like, what's the metric of success on that? And this came up when I was talking to the YDSA students, where like a lot of the very successful programs, like the Prison Moratorium Project, eventually spun out and went outside of the youth section. And so like, I think you need to also view, like, we have to also build things that are sustainable. And I think Labor Notes is an example of this. So we don't need to recreate the wheel of places where socialists can intervene in the labor movement. And I think I think that YDSA is playing such a critical role in that, because union density is tiny. Students need a venue to like actually learn about the labor movement. And that's something we can't forget. Like, a lot of us understand unions much better than most union members, because of the lack of political education done by unions. And so students who aren't from union families aren't going to know anything more than anyone else. And I think we can, but are curious, and like, we will spend time, building that. So I know you got to go, so I maybe just wanted to end there, see if there's time for one more question.
No, that's great. I guess just to add on to that, Benjamin was asking, how should faculty DSA members relate to campus YDSA chapters? What should the relationship be on campuses between, or even, I would say, even non-DSA member faculty?
Yeah, I think it's just be supportive. I think that there is a real value, as someone who's been the former YDSA organizer, and also been staff. I remember when Neil Meyer asked me to meet with a student, like being an institutional memory. Ultimately, students have to organize students, but being someone who can provide connections, who can like bring a YDSA organizer to campus, can connect the community DSA chapter with students on issues like you want to view yourself as more a facilitator, not a member of the YDSA chapter, but it doesn't mean you have to be hands off. It just means like finding those kind of ways to intervene that can be super helpful. I remember faculty helping me speak on campuses and like identifying strong students. So there's lots of ways to be supportive. So I'd encourage you to connect, with the YDSA staffer, Anna, on that. And I think that there's a lot to do. And I still think it should be organized by students, but it doesn't mean there's not everyone can do something to build the youth section.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure. I hope people really kind of take away what you've talked about today. And luckily it's archived on our channel, so you can come back and go through the chapters of history again. Please hit like, please hit subscribe, and we'll do our best in the future to continue talking about the history of the labor movement, of the socialist movement, of political institutions, because I think it's invaluable to know this history. So again, thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good night.
Take care. Bye.